Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really thoughtful and interesting conversation with one of my favorite architecture writers, Keller Easterling. Keller is an architect, a writer, and a professor at Yale University. She's written about architecture and urbanism and infrastructure and building for a variety of publications, and her most recent book is called Extrastatecraft, The Power of Infrastructure Space, and it's just so good, and I can't recommend it enough. This is sort of a different conversation than usual. Early in my interview, Keller mentioned how she didn't really like studying architecture and then didn't like practicing it, and if she's honest, she feels like she's trying to move away from architecture, and this obviously completely caught me off guard and I think really shaped the rest of the conversation, which became this sort of meandering therapeutic and kind of introspective, quiet conversation on practice and craft and imposter syndrome as we sat in her living room above Union Square over a cup of tea with the windows opened and the birds chirping outside. It really felt more like a friendly conversation than an interview. We also talk about her early education in theater and how that has influenced both her thinking around architecture and her teaching. We talk about her slow transition to academia and the types of writing that she's trying to do more of right now. Keller is a really interesting person and just one of my favorite thinkers, and I was really honored to have her on the show, especially to catch her in this time of transition, which I think made for a more reflective conversation than usual. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. Memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Keller Easterling. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, and I've been thinking about you and your work in preparing for this conversation, and I realized that you are somebody, like a lot of the designers and architects that I've talked to, that I was introduced to you through your writing. And so I kind of want to start there, actually, and because you studied architecture, and you are an architect, I'm interested in how you started writing, or where your interest in writing came from.
Well, I was studying theater before I was studying architecture, so as a performer and a director and then also a writer. So writing is really the thing that's been mostly a constant.
Interesting.
So the architecture was something that I wasn't sure, is this going to be something that will be the thing I do, or will it be something that pays the bills, or will I somehow work my way through an academic position in which writing will come back.
Yeah. Where did the architecture come in then, or when did you switch from theater to architecture?
Pretty haphazardly.
Okay.
I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but I was in Princeton and doing theater, and you had to pick a major.
Yeah.
And the school that had, its lights on when I got out of rehearsal.
Right.
School of architecture. Everybody looked cool. They were handsome men. It was, I don't know. They looked like it was an interesting thing to do. It was the only, besides engineering, the only graduate school there. So it was kind of like a more sophisticated group of people.
And so, did you have any? This is so interesting to me. Did you have any conception of what architecture was when you kind of made that switch, or what was that like kind of first introduction like when you got into that?
It seemed like it was a compromise because I had gone to school thinking that I would do medicine, some kind of crazy dream, that I would do medicine, and I think that was also kind of theatrical, I imagined myself, sort of, pressing my hand to the foreheads of, needy people or something, some kind of crazy thing.
Yeah.
So I guess the architecture was like another profession, artful profession.
Mm-hmm,
So I thought, oh, this will be a profession, but it'll be closer to the arts.
And it's interesting though too because I mentioned Jessica Helfand before we started recording, and she also has a background in theater. And before she started practicing graphic design, she studied graphic design, but one of her first jobs was writing for a sitcom, and she's talked about how writing, basically screenplays or dialogue has influenced how she thinks about design. And I also think about Bram Koolhaas and his background in, kind of screenwriting. And it's interesting that there are these kind of connections. Did you see connections between theater and architecture?
I didn't until later.
Okay.
When I was teaching and trying to figure out what it is that I really think about architecture. And I'm sure you see this too when you're teaching. You kind of maybe you remember some of your training, but you kind of come back to a moment of being an autodidact and really asking yourself, what can I, with a straight face, actually say?
Yeah.
And I think I have been, in some ways, transferring a training in theater to architecture, because it was a training that I most admired and felt most right. I think that's really all I've been doing.
So when you graduated, did you want to be an architect? Did you want to build buildings? What were your aspirations at that time?
I didn't want to be an architect. And, I was wanting to still see if I could do theater and do both of them.
Oh, interesting.
Here in New York, and did that for quite a long time, until kind of personal things or whatever in life intervened in some way. And then as my job was becoming an academic job, then it seemed my writing and creative time was largely taken up with those sorts of books, and and I was also trying to write those books in a way that satisfied some of the same energy writing, but I still do the other writing.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to kind of like now rebalance, sort of fade architecture out and bring the other writing back.
Oh, I want to come back to that, because that's something, as I was, again, thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, that was something that I was kind of noticing in the trajectory of your writing. But, so did you, when you graduated and you kind of were doing these kind of multiple things, were you working as an architect at the time also?
Yeah.
Okay.
In offices of different sorts.
Oh, okay. And while you were doing that, you were also teaching and kind of building an academic career also?
Yes. So once I got one or two little academic jobs, then I left the office and kind of scraped together.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know.
Yep,
the
this
way
sounds
in which
familiar.
This happens in New York, where you can get, teach uptown in the morning, teach downtown in the afternoon.
Yep. Yeah, I know exactly that. What you're talking about. Was academia something that you were always interested in? Was that I don't want to say ambition, but was that an interest of yours too?
No.
So how'd that happen?
It was just a way. It was an escape route out of the office.
Okay.
And I had been doing some independent research projects, and so the independent research projects were a credential that could get me into something else and out of the office.
This is really interesting to me, and I promise this whole interview isn't just going to be about your background, but the way you're talking about that reminds me of my own kind of trajectory that, I got into graphic design is the only thing I really ever wanted to do, and it's still the core of all of my interests. But then after finishing my undergraduate degree and working as a designer, kind of entry level, which is nowhere near as grueling as a entry level architect, I imagine, but kind of realizing that it wasn't everything that I thought it was going to be, or it didn't fulfill all the interests like I thought it would. And so a lot of my career and especially my decision to go to grad school was, how how do I find a way to bring all of those other things into the practice itself? Was that something that was, this is a weird way to ask that question, but was that something, did you have an interest in the practice, I guess, or kind of once you started doing it, there was nothing there?
No, I had an interest in designing.
Okay, yeah.
And like to make things and design things. So, definitely, and even, even buildings. And get ideas and want to invent things, and so there is a passion there to design, and then just in different ways, the way one's life ends up being accidentally constructed, that there are kind of resources for doing things, and did you manage to somehow have the aspiration to have an office that would have resources for doing a certain kind of thing, or did you manage to be the sort of person who, was largely doing it with two hands, and one computer, and so I ended up in the latter categories, and I suppose it's because that if you write, you need a certain kind of sanctuary and solitude, and having an office or something like that would just be the last thing I would want to do. But then also trying to kind of without getting fired from academia, manage to shift the tone of the project of what I wanted to do to fit what I wanted to do.
What was that kind of transition like, of kind of moving from the office, from the studio to academia, where you were doing them simultaneously for a while and then kind of made that decision? How long was that kind of process?
Gosh, I'm not entirely sure. Was it maybe 10 years?
Oh, okay.
10 years before getting, maybe 10 years of mixtures of things.
Right.
And then having a tenure track job.
Yeah.
Then having a tenure track job, and then moving to another tenure track job, and then eventually getting tenure. Yeah. So, but the mixture of practice and little bits of teaching before getting a tenure track job were probably maybe it was 10 years.
Okay. So it was this kind, but it was a process. It wasn't like a kind of immediate shift.
No, it might have been less than 10 years. Probably was. Probably 5 or 7.
Do you think, kind of coming back to teaching a little bit, do you think, I'm asking this question, I'm projecting, everything you're saying, I'm projecting my own story onto it, so I apologize if this doesn't make any sense at all. But I found that when I started teaching design, it kind of reignited my interest in graphic design, or allowed me to see it in a way, kind of like what you were talking about before of how teaching makes you kind of reconsider the craft. When you started teaching, were you able to find a different way into architecture, or that you saw it differently, approaching it as a theorist or educator or writer instead of a designer?
Yes, I wasn't drawing on my training at school. I didn't enjoy my training at school, and it didn't nourish anything really in me. But I had done some work on these larger scale settlement formations, and then when I got to Parsons and Pratt, I just started trying to teach, or I was assigned to teach these things that we were often assigned to teach as kind of very fundamental courses. So I found those to be really challenging and interesting, and I learned so much trying to figure out how to do it in a way that seemed honest or something, and then it also meant that in order to have anything more or less to teach, I would have to study and learn
Right.
more than I knew. So
Right.
I guess that's every teacher. But in my case, I really didn't. I mean, I was not like I had a PhD or something like that. I was not a proper scholar. So.
I mean, what you're saying is exactly my own experience. In the last fall semester, I taught an introduction to typography class, which in undergrad, it's sophomore level. It's kind of after students are done with their foundation. It's basically their first real kind of core graphic design class. And it was the hardest class I've ever taught because it was that base thing that I hadn't thought about in 10 years. And so I felt like I had to restudy all of this, think about what I could bring to it with my own experience, what I may have missed out on in my own kind of study. And so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. You find out what you care about and develop techniques and so on that no one could teach you. In fact, I'm kind of glad that there wasn't some kind of fabulous mentor, who about whom I was completely convinced or something, because then I would have just been.
Yeah.
It would have not have been any kind of difficult exploration.
I'm interested in how you said that you didn't really enjoy your studying architecture. You didn't enjoy kind of working in the studio. Your career was moving towards academia. And this question sounds like I'm making some sort of value judgment, and I'm not. I really find this fascinating. What is it about architecture that has, in some weird way, has sustained your interest for so long? You know what I mean?
Yes. There's plenty about it that is interesting, and I suppose I have felt as if I could make a contribution by seeing the ways in which space is a political pawn.
Yeah.
And then seeing the ways in which it's such a hyperbolic political pawn. And so to write about that allowed me to write a kind of footnoted fiction.
Oh, I like that.
But I think you could also argue that I've been wanting out of it for the whole of my life, and still do.
All right, well, let's talk about that a little bit, if it's okay.
I am on the couch.
Yeah, if that's okay, because as I was looking over kind of your writing and kind of rereading some things and preparing for this conversation, I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before, and it's a topic that's come up on this podcast a couple times and in my own kind of research that I'm doing separately from the podcast, and it's I'm going to mention two things. One is that I've started, based on these conversations, a definition of design that I've found fits the way that I like thinking about and talking about design is ideology made artifact. And it's kind of taking ways of seeing the world and then building them into physical things, whether that's a building or a sign or a poster or something like that. And I think in reading your work that there's a through line of some of that way of looking at the world, looking at the built world, with a little bit of that kind of lens on it. But then the second thing, and this is potentially the more interesting thing, is that there's this kind of scaling to your subject matter where I feel like your subject matters are getting bigger and bigger, especially Extrastatecraft, which is about kind of infrastructure in like the very widest sense. And so I don't know if that's a question exactly other than a reading of your work that I'm curious what you think of. But I almost feel like that scaling or that expansion is a way out of architecture maybe, or is a broadening of architecture even.
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a way out of the profession
of
architecture.
Yeah.
And I suppose that I have a friend who says that everybody thinks they are an imposter, but I really do. I really do feel like a charlatan. But I don't. But I have the sense that maybe I'm not a charlatan with my students if I am suggesting that there's some way in which their unbelievable expertise, their correlative thinking, their ability to shape the heavy information system, which is urban space, is so much more important than the way the profession works.
Yes,
And that it has so many other applications that are even more practical and financially sustainable and all the rest of it. So my holding out for something outside of that is maybe I hope still something good for them. Ideology made artifact. Maybe ideas made artifact. Probably. Ideology, I think also and this comes from theater, what I sort of have between my hands is action. Action is more like the relationship, action. Those things are carriers of information, and it's partly in the solids,
right?
But it's also in the relationship between the solids and the potentials between them. So I guess there certainly ideas, temperaments, dispositions made into solids and their relationships, actions carrying information. Abstract,
and this is kind of what you talk about in the book too, actually. And as soon as you said it, I think you're exactly right. I really like what you said about, kind of imparting on your students that there are other ways of working, that you can take these skills that you're learning now to do other things. And that's another theme that's come up again and again in these conversations, is how many people I talk to who have studied architecture and then are not doing anything that's remotely how we would narrowly define architecture. And there's something very interesting in those skills, that experience, that allow people to kind of think about larger ideas. And that's something that I think I try to do as a teacher also, especially thinking about my own undergraduate education, which, as great as it was, took a very narrow view of graphic design, that you work for clients and you design logos and books and posters, and websites were just starting to be a thing that was taught at that time, but it was you're a neutral kind of translator of someone's content into some sort of visual form. And my kind of teaching philosophy is, great, we need people to do that stuff, but graphic design can be all this other stuff too, and is so much bigger than that. And I think architecture is the same way, and I think design has become this is something that Michael Rock has said. Design has become this kind of metaphor for how we think about the world. Everything is now designed. Does that kind of opening up of the profession, or redefining of the profession, whether it's architecture or design in general, change how you approach it, or change how how your students think about it?
Yes, we work very hard to try to think of different modes of practice, and try to provide a moment to rehearse those modes of practice in school rather than struggling outside. To varying degrees of success. I don't know how. It takes a long time for some of those habits to change. There are, financial imperatives and debt and all the rest of it that make it really hard to make some of those changes as much as one would want to. No, there's no question. And the other thing in a big university that I'm trying to do is speak not just to designers about this, but to a number of other disciplines and professions. So I teach in a university-wide lecture course, which is saying to people in IR and American studies and economics and business and so on, that they should be as fluent in spatial practices as they are in econometrics or law, which is presumed you should be fluent in. You know? So, and I'm able to use spatial studies as a way to also show another picture of the world. If they're being taught about a kind of rational man and the nation state and stuff like that, I can fill 26 hours and 80 slides a piece, 80 slides each, with an irrational world that is manifest in space.
That was something I was really curious about, especially with your kind of publishing projects and your writing, and your books specifically is your the audience for the. Do you have a sense of the reader? Because and the reason I ask, and I'm sorry to kind of preface the question, but something that I'm just personally very interested in is design writing that can both be interesting to the profession, but also people outside of the profession, people who are very kind of heavily involved in the discourse, but then people who have no kind of connection to the design world. And I feel like your books cross those lines. And it could be that I'm not in architecture, and so maybe I'm not, kind of reading it as an architect, but as a designer, as someone outside of it. Do you have a sense of kind of who reads you, or when you're writing, are you thinking about who this is going to?
I have been trying to go to increasingly broader and broader audiences. I don't know how successful that's been, altering my voice, and it's also because when you're writing for your place in academia to keep your job or something, in certain ways you have to write. But I'm trying to write for a broader audience, and I've been surprised at who the audience is sometimes. Sometimes not what I would have expected. The Extrastatecraft has an audience in the art world I did not expect. I just didn't see that coming. I thought that it might be more popular amongst urbanists, or people who are thinking about social science, politics. But the art world.
That's interesting. That's what I mean. That book especially of kind of all of your writing, whether it's kind of the essays that you publish or the books. That's the one that to me seems to pop up in random places the most. So I'm not surprised to hear you say that at all.
Sometimes just how books are, who publishes them and edits them and all that. But I think that the big reason is that it was really, really trying to speak as plain exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I'm not trying to just, praise that book now, but I think it covers it goes back to this idea of scaling, or this kind of like bigger and bigger subject matter, where it does cover urbanism. I think there's some kind of media theory in there. There's some technology kind of discourse in there, and so I think it kind of hits at all these intersections and uses infrastructure as this kind of container to hold all of these. So it's, in a lot of ways, I think it's kind of the epitome of what we've been talking about, of kind of expanding out these ideas into different ways. Was that a conscious decision when you were writing it that you wanted to?
The most important chapter in that book for me was the second one about disposition.
Yeah.
Which I thought was that was really the thing I was trying to communicate, which I thought really was something that could communicate to anyone. It's just a sort of a habit of mind really was what I felt most strongly about communicating.
Yeah.
And then I honestly, and I was also intending it to be that you would move between evidentiary segments and contemplative segments, and that the reader would enjoy the difference between those two things. I think one of the things I'm feeling most strongly about with anything I'm writing is the structure of it as a thing that is read, irrespective of content.
Right.
That this was this kind of I sometimes said, like a two-part epoxy, like what would it be like to have these different kinds of segments? Would it give pleasure to move from one to another, just in terms of tone and voice?
Do you think that studying, kind of hearing you talk about that and kind of talking about guiding the reader, it's reminding me of the beginning of the conversation. We were talking about theater and transitioning into architecture. Do you think that studying architecture or thinking about space and urbanism has actually changed how you think about writing, or your writing process even?
Yes, because what I have found so difficult to try to convey to architects who are looking largely at objects,
Right.
I'm trying to unfocus eyes to look at the matrix in which the objects are suspended.
Right.
And that, noticing how difficult that is for architects, and maybe I'm using architects as kind of a straw man, but I think it's difficult for the whole of culture. So I've learned something by working with my funny subjects of architects, which I am supposedly one. That what we're really bad at, seeing past the object, the rest of the world is also pretty bad at. And so that work has given me another. It inspires me to work on that kind of content with many other topics besides architecture.
Right.
So that kind of unfocusing, that kind of sense of the disposition of the matrix, temperament, those kinds of things, even when the subject has nothing to do with architecture.
Right. Do you, so, this podcast kind of started with my interest in design criticism and kind of the writing about design and how we talk about graphic design specifically. And, I kind of was frustrated a little bit that so much of design writing was about the object itself. And my interest, or at least the kind of design writing that I'm trying to do and that I like to read the most, is kind of pulling back from the object a little bit to look at the conditions of how that design was made, but then also the world that it was put into. And so I'm curious, kind of your thoughts on, this term design criticism or architecture criticism, and do you have any thoughts on the role that, whether it's architecture or design, criticism should serve, or that you would like to see it serve?
Well, I guess I mean, there are so-called architecture critics who are very good at kind of convening thought, and they're journalists or whatever. That's one kind of thing. But I guess the critical thinking, which might not come, is might not be called a critic, but the kind of critical thinking is essential in my view, to the most practical consideration. I don't separate them. You know, like I don't separate making and the critical thinking. And I've also even more recently been realizing the ways in which my critical thinking and reportage and theory about space and urbanism has also been in kind of a safe place unless it is working practically and unless it is actually engaged. I think, you know, you could say, oh well, this person who only wants to practice and make form, they you know, in this sort of so-called post-critical thing, which is an absurd term, impossible term.
Yeah.
But I'm also feeling kind of the flip side of that, like, has my critical writing kept me safe
That's interesting.
from a certain kind of criticality that and embarrassment that comes from actually making proposals. You know, and I'm in no way saying, "Oh no, just leave me alone. I want to make form." That's not in that post-critical, but I also want to recognize that there's growth in my own criticality and in the ways people can critique me if I make embarrassing proposals.
How do you kind of articulate that in your own work?
Well, I am a designer.
Yeah.
As it turns out, I love design and I have design ideas. I know what I want to do. You know, but often I'm designing through as a studio critic. Not designing students' projects, but the ideas I'm getting as a designer. In that vein. And it's only kind of like once a year or something that I have a kind of actual thing where I have to make certain kind of form. I've just been working on a project for the Biennale, and it has involved my being a form maker. I guess I think that the form maker is a little bit young, you know, like a little bit, you know, baby in diapers, just making the form, you know, like. I worry actually that it's kind of babyish, that it hasn't.
Oh, interesting.
That it hasn't had a chance. Certain parts haven't had a chance to mature as much as. As you know, or that I'm not discerning enough. But then I actually worry about that at almost every level.
I would think so.
But things not being learned enough or sophisticated enough.
I have a couple more questions just to kind of wrap everything up. But I'm very curious about how you think about all these various activities that you're involved in. You know, like, do you have like designated days for each? Like, when you wake up in the morning, are you writing every day? Like, how do these things all really kind of fit together on a day-to-day level for you?
It's kind of mixed up.
Okay, good. That's what I.
If there was a videotape of it, you'd see someone very methodically doing what seems to be the same thing every single day. You know, like largely, you know, a certain ritualistic in terms of constant work until cocktail hour. But what's going on, you know, like actually at the desk is just moving all over the place and completely distracted, like moving from one thing to another, like moving across categories and moving across tasks and.
I mean, I asked that question purely selfishly, as I feel like my career has diversified, especially in the last 2 years or so. And it was basically because I was curious, because I don't know I still feel like I'm just jumping from one thing to the next, and you seem like you have it master. You seem like you have a large output that you must have some sort of way to organize it.
Well, I work a lot.
Yeah.
Steady worker.
Okay, that sounds good.
That's what they say. Yeah. That's the faint praise. Someone, yeah, I work pretty hard, I guess. I mean, I have no sense that this is what it should be.
Yeah,
or
yeah.
It doesn't feel like, this is well organized, or somehow it's coming to its own about
right.
how it should work or something like that. It feels, and especially now as I'm trying to kind of like fade up the other kind of thing, I feel like a novice all the time.
That was the next question that I had about this kind of fading up this other side. A question that I ask everybody that I talk to, and so I'm going to ask you that question, and I'm going to ask you a different question. What I ask everybody is, what are the issues or topics or kind of subjects that you think designers should be talking about today or writing about, or what are the kind of critical or theoretical discourses that feel very important for right now? And so that's one question, and you don't have to answer that if you don't want, because this other question might erase the other one. Talking about moving away from architecture, moving into, fading up these other things. What do those other things look like? What are the subjects that you're interested in right now?
Well, I guess it goes back to the things we were talking about before, where what it seems most interesting to me to do is to be able to focus on disposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To be able to focus on matrices, to have that kind of sixth sense about how to reduce violence and tension. It sounds so corny, but how to reduce violence and tension in our environments of any kind.
Right. Yeah.
So, what the other writing looks like is some form of writing that it gives pleasure, not because it's a collection of short stories or a novel or something like that, but they are suites of different kinds of narratives. And then the suites are also, there's more than one suite. So what I'm experimenting with is how those things can give pleasure while also kind of unfocusing eyes a little bit.
And like subject matter wise, are you kind of exploring other things that you haven't explored before, or does it do these? I love the way you're talking about this. Does it kind of follow the vein of your career interests?
No, it's fiction.
Okay, yeah.
So it's
this sounds so great.
It's it's about all kinds of. It's about people. It's not
Yeah.
About,
I love that.
Not focused on architecture.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. Oh, I'm so curious. My last question. This is another question that I ask everybody. I'm interested in if there are writers or theorists or books that have kind of really shaped just how you think about all of this that we've talked about, or people, for someone listening to this who's kind of intrigued by these subjects, who are those touchstones for you?
Well, in terms of thinkers, I have treated Gregory Bateson as a kind of brother, uncle.
Yeah.
Uncle. I've also another kind of funny uncle is Gilbert Ryle. Another one who it's another uncle, I guess. Is Benton Mackay. And then there are And like little bits of a lot of things, and
Yeah.
not the whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good. Your three uncles I thought were really interesting. And the middle one, Gregory, that name I don't know.
Gilbert Ryle is the one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know who that is.
Gilbert Ryle was someone who was trying to kind of critique a Cartesian mind-body split by thinking about how the mind, how mind operates, and looking at it through ordinary language theory.
Interesting.
But just a very sort of frank. I mean, he's an odd one,
Yeah.
and someone who doesn't often make it. So, someone who often doesn't make it into kind of contemporary bibliographies.
Yeah, I've never heard of him.
But I'm really interested in him.
Okay, I'll look him up. That actually sounds really interesting.
There's probably very good scholarly reasons why he doesn't, why Bruno Latour doesn't talk about him, even though, or why Gregory Basin doesn't talk about him either, even though they all kind of prefigure each other, but they keep a lid on certain parts of the bibliography, I guess.
This is always my favorite part of these conversations, when someone introduces me to someone that I've never heard of, but sounds like they're in that constellation of people that I'm interested in. Keller, this was really, really great for me. Like I said before we started recording, I'm a big fan of just your writing. I just love the way that you write, and your subject matter is something that I'm very deeply interested in. And so, like I said, you've been someone that I've been wanting to talk to for a while, and I'm just glad that we got to do this and found this just really interesting and fascinating. I just love the way that you kind of think about all of these things. So thank you so much for this conversation. It was great.
Thank you. You're so good at this conversation.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on May 9th, 2018 in New York City. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.